wrote her first poem on a toy printing press with handset type, and has now written 11 novels. I assume not on the toy printing press anymore. Warming Up was published in 2013, Courting Kathleen Hannigan in 2007, and her musical Fairways has been produced 3 times here in the Chicago area. She also practices advertising, entertainment, and media law with Winston and Strawn, earning degrees from Brown University and her JD from Yale. And she has acquired the title Best Advertising Lawyer in Chicago in 2012. Her sister, Donna Steele, is director of the Steel Beam Theater up here in St. Charles. She has a website, of course. It's called MaryHutchingsRead.com. Mary, could you come up and read for us?
Thank you, Kevin, and happy anniversary to the Waterline writers. It's really an honor to be here. I'm really happy to be celebrating with you tonight. I thought I'd read the beginning of my novel, Warming Up, which is a novel about a singer who doesn't sing, a sculptor who doesn't sculpt, and a chance encounter with a homeless kid that changes everything. The novel opens with Kix's point of view for about a page. I'm a sucker for kind eyes, and often they're a sucker for me. That's why I like to meet my marks face to face before I make my first approach. I give them a chance to see I'm just a kid. I am, and I'm basically pretty harmless. I'm not a violent person, not like my dad. I don't mean to hurt anyone. So I hang around places where I know people can afford it if I take 10 or 20 off them. Fancy restaurants and clubs aren't good. People rush by as if my mere presence on the same block as them could spoil their entire evening. Mostly, I go places where the people are rich enough, but more likely to be sympathetic to those less fortunate, as they like to call us. Places like art museums, the symphony, theaters, certain city churches. Recently, I've been working outside Michigan Avenue doctors' and therapists' offices. There's a fair amount of upper middle class guilt there, and that works to my advantage. Not that I intend this to be my life's work. It's just what I do right now to get by, to support Charmaine and the baby, just until we figure out what's what and what's next. What's next is that he meets Cecilia Morrison on the street, and he bums $60 off of her with the promise that he'll return it when he gets home. She is seeing a therapist for her midlife crisis, and she's trying to tell her therapist why she did it. I can't believe I coughed up $60. I knew I was being taken, and I just let myself. Is that what you call progress, doctor? Does that show that I'm less defended now than I used to be? Is that the kind of miraculous transformation I'm supposed to have here? And just to be clear, Cecilia, I never suggested that you would have or were supposed to have a miraculous transformation. You came to me, remember, with certain issues, and you thought I could help you deal with them. She fixed her gaze out the window. You'd think that someone you were paying big bucks to would be a little nicer to you. Dr. Richardson had a real tendency to piss her off. Over the past month or so of their relationship, she got stirred up right before her appointments, almost like she was itching for a fight, and he would neither overtly start one nor defend himself, hugging the goddamn neutral center. She'd been telling him about the boy and the $60, and he couldn't explain to her why she'd done it. She didn't say that she hadn't stopped thinking about the kid for a week, and that she'd returned to the plaza yesterday and the day before just to see if she might get a glimpse of him on the street. You wanted the boy to like you? Dr. Richardson asked. He was so rarely started thread of conversation, she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. She shrugged. I don't know where you get that. I get it from the fact that you did it, Dr. Richardson said evenly. Why do you think you did it? He needed it, she said, tossing it off. How do you know he needed it? Because he asked, she said between clenched teeth. His obvious questions infuriated her, as if she were being forced to answer a series of stupid questions which only led to the conclusion that one was stupid. Is the stove hot? What happens when you put your hand in fire? Did you put your hand in fire? Was it hot? Did you burn yourself? What would have happened if you hadn't given him the money? He asked. I don't know, she said. And in the face of his silence, she played it out. He wouldn't have hurt me, if that's what you mean. He just would have gone away, gotten the money from someone else. She'd given the money because the boy asked. Simple as that. Perhaps another person wouldn't have, but so what? She'd heard a friend talk once about traveling to third world countries in their small sailboat and being asked by total strangers for pencils or gum or even for their shoes. Her friend had said no. The cruisers, who'd said yes, found it terribly uncomfortable and said they'd never go back. The ones who'd said no, that they didn't have gum or pencils to give away and needed their shoes themselves, had actually become friends with the local people. The ones that could be guilted so easily had shown a certain amount of disrespect and therefore had been disrespected as easy marks. The unapologetic ones, the ones who didn't claim to have so much that they could so easily spare it, had visited as equals. The askers really hadn't anticipated a yes and so weren't particularly disappointed. They were no worse off for having made the ask. She'd understood her friend, and it made some sense to her intellectually. But in her gut, she couldn't imagine not giving the gum or the pencils when she had so much and the person asking had so little. Well, maybe not the shoes. The thought of that was kind of creepy. But it was only a matter of degree, not principle. $60 was like a pencil to her. So a little bit later, Haverhill, her therapist, who is a sculptor himself and having trouble sculpting, is thinking about Cecilia's problem with her art and his own problems with art. And so this is from his point of view. Cecilia lacked the essential self-confidence of an artist, the ability to stand apart from her art and judge it, good and bad, without extending those adjectives to herself. An artist had to weather wrong criticism and false praise to set her own standards. A coach could tell you whether you were on pitch, but the artistry, the artistic statement, was solely yours. And it was the artistry that gave rise to the joy Cecilia seemed to be lacking. Why was he even thinking of Cecilia? He'd never himself produced a satisfactory work. He'd taken secret pleasure in the few clay models he'd managed, but he'd never declared himself in a more permanent media, not wood or bronze or tin or stone. What was he afraid of? He wasn't trying to create something for public display, so what could possibly be holding him back? He could name Cecilia's fear of displeasing her mother, but he couldn't name his own. Perhaps it had something to do with permanence. Everything in Haverhill's life was so ephemeral, so intangible. His relationships with the patients he knew the best were still one-way, once or twice a week affairs. His professional relationships were not social. His social relationships were mostly his wife's. Without Roz, many of those were a bit wary of friendship with him. People didn't like the idea that he might be analyzing them. He wasn't. They weren't that interesting. But still, sometimes he felt lonely, as if huge chunks of life were passing him by. His daughter had lived with him for barely 18 years and then gone off to her own life. The woman to whom he pledged till death had died way too young, way short of forever. Everything seemed so transient. Cecilia's art also. She could perform on stage, make a big or small mistake, continue, forget, move on. It would disappear. That notion appealed to him. Why wasn't that comforting to Cecilia? Why didn't that free her to perform with complete abandon, come what will? The performance ephemeral, over, only a memory, no permanent record. Even the newspaper reviews buried in archives, irrelevant. That was the essence of live theater, that it was, like life itself, like life's problems and life's triumphs, transitory. But sculpture? It defied death. It was deathless. It intimidated him. Thank you.